Δεν θα πω παραπάνω, μπορείτε να δείτε online και το CV της, όπως και των άλλων εκλεκτών καλεσμένων. Είναι μία από τους ανθρώπους που τρέχουν τα πράγματα πλέον στην ανοιχτή πρόσβαση και το μελετάει πάρα πολύ, γνωρίζει σε βάθος το θέμα αυτό. Τη ζητήσαμε επομένως, δεδομένου ότι σήμερα η ημερίδα μας αφορά πολιτικές ανοιχτής πρόσβασης, να μας μιλήσει για το θέμα αυτό και να αναφερθεί συγκεκριμένα σε φορείς χρηματοδότησης έρευνας και σε φορείς διεξαγωγής έρευνας, δηλαδή πανεπιστήμια και σε ό,τι αφορά εμάς, Υπουργείο Παιδείας, ΓΕΓΕΤ κτλ. Τι γίνεται στο εξωτερικό, πώς μπορούμε να υιοθετήσουμε και εμείς τέτοιες πολιτικές, ποιες είναι οι διαδικασίες που χρειάζονται, επιτυχημένα παραδείγματα και τα σχετικά. Νομίζω ότι θα είναι πολύ σημαντική η συμβολή της και με τα λόγια αυτά να την καλέσουμε να μας μιλήσει. Άλμα.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to all the organisers of this meeting for inviting me here this morning. I'm going to move that over so that I can also look at the screen and see what my slides are doing. Good morning. Victoria gave me this title. Normally my titles are about 3 words long, but this one is very, very long. However, I'm going to do my best to speak to that title. First of all, just to reiterate what the previous 2 speakers, Jean-François and Tom, have already talked about, which is the routes to open access, because this is important in policy making. First of all, we have the green route, and that means using repositories to make work available. Now, what policies ask researchers to do is write their paper, submit it to a journal, any journal that they choose. Any journal that they choose, whether it's open access or not. When the paper has been peer reviewed, they send it back to the journal with all the corrections done, and at the same time put a copy of that paper, their own final version of that paper, into their repository. That makes it open access, and the journal also publishes the paper as normal. So for those people who are in institutions that can afford to buy the journal, they access the paper through the journal. For all those others, and there are hundreds of times more people who cannot afford to buy the journal, they use the repository copy. The repository is complementing the subscription access of the journal. It's very important to remember that, because people do confuse green open access with not using journals, and that is not true. You publish in a journal as normal, but you also put a copy in your repository, which will make it accessible to those people who do not subscribe to the journal. The gold route to open access is by publishing in an open access journal. Now, some of those journals, actually less than half, make a charge to publish your work that way. And those charges can be quite high, something like 3,000 euros per article in some cases. So this may be a route, understandably, that you do not want to go down. However, if you have the money and you like some particular open access journals, please go ahead and publish in them, because they are doing a very good job for open access. I would just like to say one more thing about the green route, because Jean-François this morning had the word delayed open access after that. That's not, I don't like to contradict my great friend Jean-François, but green open access is not necessarily delayed. More than 60% of journals allow you to make your work open access through that repository immediately. And so I don't want to start seeing that word delayed associated with green open access. The number of journals allowing immediate access is going up, not down. So we must be careful there. And mandatory policies, which I'm now going to talk about for the rest of my talk, are normally about green open access because policymakers do not like to interfere with the academic freedom of choosing which journal you publish in. And although there are many open access journals, not all journals are open access. So you can't really tell people to publish in an open access journal because they may not want any of those, to publish in any of those ones that are open access. This is the state of affairs with respect to mandatory open access policies at the moment. It's over the last 10 years or so. You will see that the number of policies is rising and has been rising. The biggest growth has been, understandably, at institutional level, the blue sections of these bars, because there are 15,000, roughly, research universities in the world. And so we have a long way to go before we get all of those having a policy. But there are far fewer funders, and many of those already have a policy. So the level at which we're working is at funder level, because it's very important that the funders understand and put a policy in place. But it is equally important that university managers understand the advantages of open access outside their university and the advantages to their university of making the work done in that university open access. And I need say no more about those advantages because you heard them from Tom just before coffee. So this is a pattern for the institutional mandates. And I just want to explain that big line in 2009. It was when 24 universities in Finland all announced a policy on the same day. So they had developed their policy together, and there were 24 technical universities in Finland announcing their policy at the same time. This is the pattern for funder mandates. Don't be disheartened if you think that funders are losing interest. They are not, but there was a big group of funders at the beginning who saw the reason for open access early on, developed and announced policies. Funders are still doing that, and we're quite happy with the way funder policies are developing. The reason I emphasize the mandatory nature of a policy is shown on this slide. These 4 universities, different ones, we've got QUT here that Tom came from, one in Portugal, CERN in Geneva, of course, the European Nuclear Research Establishment, and the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom, have all had mandatory policies for quite a long time now. And they have gathered the data for this slide were collected about 2 years ago, so the numbers have gone up since then. They have gathered about 60% of their total outputs in open access in their repositories. This is the average for those 4 institutions, about 60%. And this is the average across the world where there aren't many mandates other than these few. So the world average for voluntarily making your work open access is about 15 to 20%. The universities with the mandatory policy can beat that 3 to 4-fold, 3 to 4 times better. And in fact, over the last year, all those universities have increased the proportion of their work, of their research that is open access quite extensively. So 70% plus now. So that's why you need the policy to be mandatory. If you ask people to do it or say, it would be very nice if you would put your work in our repository, they will not do it. You have to You have to say they must, and then you have to reward them for doing that. And part of the reward will come intrinsically to them because they will see their citations go up and their visibility grow and their impact grow. Now to H2020. Now I'm going to say this very quickly because we've heard from Jean-François the details here. This was a mandatory policy on part of FP7 research, but it only said make your best effort to make your work open access. And that was quite a weak policy, if I may say so, Jean-François. He does know that. In Horizon 2020, it will be much stronger and it will cover the whole research program. It will be a green open access mandate. In other words, you will make your work available through your institutional repository. That will be collected up by OpenAIRE, this large European repository, and that will provide a shop window on European research. If your university does not have a repository, and I'm afraid that I didn't check the Greek universities before I came, you may...
12 or so have institutional...
They all have one, okay? Okay, you've got them, but they're empty. All right, I don't need to say. Don't need to say what you do if you haven't got one. Then, so you have got one. There's no excuse. The other thing the policy from the Commission will do will be to permit payments for gold open access publication charges from the grants that are given out. Now, we've seen a number of new policies in Europe this year. So this is 2012. I'm not going back beyond that, and there were already some in place. For institutions, we've seen these ones, Portugal, Spain, UK and Belgium, institutions, universities within those countries making new policies. And with respect to funders, we've seen the European Research Council, we've heard about that from Jean-François. We've seen national policies in Denmark and Ireland. We've seen the research councils in the United Kingdom strengthen their policy, revise it and so-called strengthen it. And we've seen the European Commission's announcement about the policy for Horizon 2020. Now, in my view, the most important thing about policy development is that policies align. If researchers are funded by a funder that has a certain kind of policy and their university has another kind of policy, that is very, very confusing. They may even be funded by more than one funder that have different policies. So our efforts now are going to be directed into trying to achieve an aligned policy environment in Europe. If policies all match pretty well, then that irons out any problems for researchers who may find themselves in teams where there are members of that team in one country or another country. Those policies, we hope, will match. They may have grants coming from the Commission, they may have grants from their national research funder, they may have grants from a private research funder. We want the policies that cover those grants to match so that the researchers are not confused about what they need to do and don't have to do several different things. So that is going to be the aim of Spark Europe and other advocacy organisations. They may not know that yet, but I have just declared that aim for them for the next 5 years. Aligning policies supports the harmonisation agenda of the European Commission, particularly with respect to the ERA, and it's going to be a key issue in changing author practices and the norms by which they live and disseminate their work. It will also allow a kind of generic infrastructure to be developed within Europe that supports open access. We've mentioned OpenAIRE, that's part of that generic infrastructure. We've mentioned institutional repositories, that's really the other part. And we want those things to be covered by the same policy environment so that they can get their standards set and they all operate in the same way. And that means that we will have a nice, visible to Google, as well as other research engines, visible European database of research. The alignment is going quite well, except for just tiny details, across all the national policies that have been announced in recent years, except for one, which embarrassingly is the UK's. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that now. But I think that is not set in stone. We are seeing headlines like this in the Times Higher Education Supplement, just to inform you that our new national policy is about gold open access, and our government research funders, our research councils, have proposed to spend 100 million British pounds over the next 5 years on paying publication charges, as well as continuing to pay for subscriptions for journals. The 100 million British pounds will come off the top of the research grant budget. I don't need to explain to you how welcome that is to the research community. Not. So there's a lot, so you can see headlines like this, and there's a lot of discussion still to go. This is from the Times Higher Ed this very morning, just saying that the plan that we have in the UK for doing this is unlikely to cross to the US, which is currently discussing a big national policy. UNESCO helpfully commissioned some guidelines on open access policy last year, and they were published early this year, in February, I think. You can find those guidelines on the web. They contain an extensive background information section about open access, the reasons for it, and the advantages of open access. And then they lay out the kinds of things that policymakers need to take into account when developing an open access policy. And as I say, we're trying to help policymakers align their policy with existing good ones. So the policy development issues that need to be thought about by policymakers when they're considering their policy are these here. Importantly, who is going to hold the rights to the work? Now, under most jurisdictions, the rights to that intellectual property are the author's, until the author does something silly and signs them over to the publisher. There is no need to sign your rights over to the publisher, even though that has been the norm up until now. You can sign over some rights to the publisher, which allow the publisher to publish your work, and you can retain the right to put your work wherever you like, to make it available to people and allow them to do what they want with it. Now, I'm not going to go into details about these things because I don't have time in this talk, but you will find those arguments in that UNESCO document. Secondly, and also the author and the institution can work together to retain the rights that they need to make the work freely available. Secondly, is there going to be a waiver? Is there going to be a little clause in that policy that says you may opt out of this if you ask? Now, Tom Cochrane mentioned that at QUT they do have such a thing, and so actually do most universities, for information that is going to be commercialized, information that is highly sensitive, so this bit may be kind of military research or national security related research, or which has other kinds of private or privacy issues. Research, some social science and some medical research is in that category. And where we are talking about that kind of information, then a waiver is very appropriate, because we cannot force people to make available things that should be secret. But that does not count for most research. Most research should definitely not be secret. And if it's going to be published in a journal, the question is, why on earth would you want to try and keep it secret if you're just about to publish it in a journal? So we're talking about the publishable research body. The embargo period. Now, this is stipulated by some publishers who wish to protect their sales, so they don't want to see authors making their papers freely available before the publisher can sell the journal. That's completely understandable, even though the evidence doesn't show that they lose any sales if it's made freely available. But there are ways in designing your policy to comply with the publisher's wishes and still make the work open access. And finally, any policymaker who makes a policy without deciding how they're going to measure compliance is not going to get compliance. A successful funder policy, the National Institutes of Health in the USA, born as a voluntary policy in 2009. As I've said, voluntary policies don't work, and it didn't. So in 2007, the US Congress mandated the NIH to make it a mandatory policy. The US government told the NIH to do better, and the NIH did make its policy mandatory. It has achieved about 75% compliance, but it's not satisfied, and it has just announced that it is going to strengthen the process by which it measures the compliance, and for those researchers in receipt of grants from the NIH who do not comply will find that the next bit of their grant money will not be handed over until they mend their ways. So this is tough. The Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom has said much the same thing this summer, but this is a bigger funder, and this is very important. It's an important example to other funders and policymakers. A successful university policy, the University of Liège in Belgium, as well as QUT, which we heard about before. I'm now going to talk about another one. This says that you must deposit your articles in ORBI, which is the institutional repository. Immediately, they have been accepted for publication. So I described at the beginning, you write your article, send it off for peer review. The peer reviewers send back comments, you attend to that, and then you send the final version to the publisher. At the same time, you put that final version in your repository, in this case, in ORBI. If the publisher allows, and more than 60% of them do, that paper will be made open access immediately. So even before it's published, the world will be able to see your work, and your impact and citations will start to grow from that point. If the publisher demands an embargo, you will comply, and you do that by, as you put the paper in the repository, there will be a little field, and it will say length of embargo, and then you click no months, 6 months, 12 months. You click which is relevant to the journal that you're submitting your work to. You comply with it. The repository keeps your paper, the full text, closed to the world for that period, 6 months or 12 months. But in that period, the metadata are open. By that, I mean the title, your name and the other authors, the abstract, where you work, and which journal this is going to be published in or has been published in, will all be available through Google to anyone searching for you or using keywords that relate to your work. And then your repository software will have a little button that users can click. If the paper is closed in the embargo period, they can click that and it will send you as the author an email which says, I really want to see this, but it's embargoed. Please would you email me a copy? And for that 6 months or 12 months, you act in the traditional way that all authors have acted by sending out reprints to people who would like to see them. And you do it electronically. Okay? So your impact and visibility are still going to happen in that embargo period by this means. This is ORBI. It's a very well-filled repository. It has 50,000 articles in it. Here I'm just showing the the place where the newest articles continually roll up each day. The articles that have just been deposited that day are shown in that column, and there's a little news announcement saying they've just got over 50,000 articles, full text, in the repository. So, how do they do that? What the rector at the University of Liège did with his policy was said all those things I've just gone through, but knowing that not everybody would comply, even though he's told them to do this, he said one more thing, and that was, you do not need to comply with this. You are academics, and academics do not necessarily comply with university rules. I understand that. However, if you want any committee in this university, promotions committee, tenure committee, or me, or your head of department, to look at your record and judge you for promotion or tenure or an award or whatever else you're after, we will look in Orbi for your work. Don't send me an email list of your references. Don't come to my office with a pile of them printed out. I can use Orbi, I can search for you, and that is what I'm going to do. So if you want me to know about your work, tell me that you would like me to look at your record. I will look in Orbi. As a result of that, the deposits have gone very nicely, so we're over 50,000 now, and you will see a little blip there. April, May, the first year he said this. April, May is the time when applications for tenure and promotion go in at the University of Liège. So you can see that that little extra detail, by linking the repository to personal advancement within the university by that researcher, has just done the trick. And then, as soon as they start to deposit, they start to see the increased citations and impact that come from it. There really is no need now for that stick bit of the policy, because the researchers are getting their own reward from putting their work in the repository. So I think, Victoria, you are too pessimistic about how long this might take. It won't take 10 years. And what you do is you get some researchers putting their work in there, and then word of mouth does the rest of it. They start looking at their citation graph, and it does this, like Tom showed us. And then they say, hey, now I know how to do that. This is the usage of that repository. Tom showed you downloads from QUT's repository. These are the ones coming from Orbi, roughly 50 or 60,000 a month for that body of work in there. This, don't forget, is extra new usage by people who do not have access to the journals. If you have access to the journal because your library's bought it, you look at these papers in the journal. These are new people around the world who do not have the journal, but are now able to see the work of the people at Liège. The University of Edinburgh in the UK has a strategic plan. It's just coming to an end this period, but it will be renewed. And it says very simply this: the mission of our university is the creation, dissemination, and curation of knowledge. Note that word, dissemination. It's in there, and it's been in that plan for the last 4 years. University has a mandatory policy for open access and a very nice repository. So that's a very good example of a university's management which understands the benefit of open access to that university, understands that there is a moral imperative for making work open access because it's been publicly funded, and has stated it perfectly clearly in its mission for that period. You can't have a better or simpler mission than that, in my view. So, thank you very much for listening. Do you want me to take any questions now?
Yes, does anyone have any questions? No, it's all clear to us.
Okay.
I think,
That's fine.
No,
Thank you.
I'm joking.